Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Good afternoon and welcome to all. My name is and I teach theology and history of Christianity here at the University of Chicago Divinity School. And it is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you a distinguished speaker not from this native soil, but from the Low Countries overseas, even below the sea, namely Professor Dr. Frits van Oostrom. I do so on behalf of the Divinity School, but also on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Martin Marty Center, the Medieval Workshop, the Early Modern Workshop, and the Human Christi Institute. While Professor van Oostrom once was the youngest full professor in the Netherlands at age 29, with all the youthful bravura that accompanied having a distinguished position at such a young age, some decades later now, he's still unceasingly active in medieval Dutch literature, his chosen academic field. But he's increasingly also considered a national so-called eminence grise, with a grey not referring to age or hair color, but to the wash of the capuchin robe of Cardinal Richelieu's confidant, with whom the term once originated. Professor van Oostrom is a senior authority, in other words, with senior based on expertise, vision, and insight. An advisor in many fields also outside his own. Most recently, Professor van Oostrom has served as chair of the National Committee on Sustainable Humanities, which tries to inject extra funds into the humanities, and through that generate more synergy and protect vulnerable subfields in an attempt to keep the humanities as a whole both vibrant and vital. Given his span of interest and his mastery of diverse subjects, it is almost impossible to give you a good impression of Professor van Oostrom's status in Dutch academia and society at large. In his core field of medieval Dutch literature, his various books, most recently Stemmen op Schrift, Voices on Record, published in 2006, and De Wereld in Woorden, The World in Words, published just last year, have not only become required reading for Dutch academics, but have also gained a reputation as desired reading for a much wider lay audience. To illustrate the rather unique status of his work, let me reference one of Professor van Oostrom's earlier books, namely Maarlands Wereld, The World of Jacob van Maarland. At the time, if I'm correct, the year was 1995, Professor van Oostrom had just won the Dutch Spinoza Prize, awarded annually as a personal prize to 3 or 4 of the most promising researchers, scholars in the Netherlands across all fields. Having thus been branded a cutting-edge intellectual alongside physicists and mathematicians for work that surely must have included the research for Maarlands Wereld, Professor van Oostrom went on to publish the book in 1996, but now won for it the premier Dutch literary prize, the ACO Literatuurprijs, beating out our country's premier novelist. To my knowledge, it had never happened before, and has certainly not since, that one and the same scholarly book excelled both in terms of the breadth and literary appeal it had for a wide readership, and the lasting depth of the scholarly analysis reached in it. Having been professor of medieval Dutch literature and Dean of Humanities for a period at Leiden University since 1982, Professor van Oostrom returned to his alma mater, Utrecht University, as its first university professor in 2002, after which his national prominence and visibility through various advisory roles and senior appointments quickly grew. Between 2005 and 2008, he was president of the Dutch Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in a widely publicized and televised process, Professor van Oostrom also oversaw the development of a Dutch canon for history and culture between 2005 and 2007. In doing so, he proved able to withstand much political pressure for the good of a now widely accepted educational tool taught to both native and immigrant children in Dutch high schools. I could probably go on and list other memorable feats, such as his appointment as Erasmus Chair at Harvard University, but knowing Professor van Oostrom, I think he would prefer us to just get down to business, especially his favorite business of analyzing medieval Dutch literature, which is among the earliest of European vernaculars and, as he will show, important for the development of economic as well as spiritual virtues in European society. Before yielding him the floor, permit me just to tell you that Professor van Oostrom has recently developed an app for medieval Dutch literature called Vogala, which may or may not surface in his talk, but which shows again how societal engagement and academic merit can indeed go hand in hand. Please join me in welcoming Professor van Oostrom to the University of Chicago for a lecture entitled After Huizinga, the Low Countries as Cradle of Spiritual Innovation in the Late Middle Ages.
This is what we can only call too generous introductions. I'm afraid I can only disappoint you now, but well, we'll see. Thank you very much. Well, you showered a lot of praise upon me, but being a Dutch medievalist, I'm of course also very fortunate and honored to travel, so to say, on the passport of another man. And we have a slide. Oh, he's already there with us. You mentioned him, he's mentioned in my title as well. This is Johan Huizinga, as we say in Dutch, Huizinga, quite harshly, but never mind. Huizinga, Huizinga, I've heard his name in many languages, and of course you know him. He's also a very famous man here, a truly great historian for sure, of many important books. With his major work, undoubtedly this one, The Waning of the Middle Ages, as it was called in the first English translation, or more aptly in the more recent one, The Autumn of the Middle Ages. A book that surely deserves to be recognized as one of the major books in medieval studies at large, and probably even one of the great history books at large, at least this status, and certainly in America, as far as I know, is something that it has acquired. It came out in 1919, so almost a century ago, when Johan Huizinga was 47 at the time. He was born in 1872 in Groningen, in the north of the Netherlands, and it was his third book, but in a completely different vein and with a spectacular wider scope and ambition than his two earlier ones. This is his first book, his PhD dissertation on Sanskrit drama, the completion of his studies in Indology at Leiden University. And then, so this was 1897, then in 1911, this edition came out of the oldest sources of history of the Dutch city of Haarlem, where Huizinga had become a teacher after his PhD, and in his spare time he delved into the local archive of Haarlem for a solid pittance of historical craftsmanship, an edition of the primary sources of Haarlem history, the only work of that type that Huizinga would publish in his lifetime, this type of work, but exactly what was needed at that moment to make him, to the academic world, a respectable historian, qualified to be appointed at a regular chair of history, first at Groningen University, and then several years later at the prestigious chair of history at Leiden University in 1914. That was his work up till then, and then in 1919 this book came out, Herfsttijd der Middeleeuwen. A book at the time completely at odds with the conventions among Dutch history professors at the time, whose professional style was rather narrowly focused and not particularly adventurous, better safe than sorry seems to have been their motto. They prefer to dig very deeply into subjects and to report about their findings in a strictly neutral, impersonal style. That was how history was done in the Netherlands at the time, while everybody, or almost everybody, considered literary flourishings and things like that as the hallmark of fiction writing, so not for serious academics. So, unsurprisingly, this Herfstijder Middeleeuwen, at first in Dutch academic circles, was the reception was at least highly mixed, to say the least. Some colleagues of Huizinga at the time are reported to have referred to the book dismissively, of course, as Huizinga's detective, or even that novel of Huizinga. That was how they saw it. And in fact, the general opinion on Herfstijder Middeleeuwen among Dutch academics has remained at least ambivalent for quite a long time. Nowadays, the book is of course appreciated certainly much better and is held in high esteem, and many Dutch history professors are in fact quite proud to be working in the great tradition of Huizinga. That's how things go, I suppose. For this conversion, but for this reception has been somewhat of a conversion in the Netherlands. The Dutch academic world has needed substantial help from outside and abroad. And just to mention a few factors in this conversion, without elaborating on any of them, although they would deserve that, I mentioned just a few. First, let's say the linguistic and cultural turn in historical studies at large, which of course gave Herfstijder Middeleeuwen quite suddenly a huge relevance. Second, the upcoming interest in Histoire de Mentalité, the history of psychology, the connection between history and anthropology, psychohistory, that also is of course very much relates to what is done in this work, Herfstijder Middeleeuwen. And third, and probably as most important factor of all, the wide and the long-standing acclaim of Herfstijder from abroad. By now there exist more than 20 translations of this book, which is, I think, quite unparalleled in Dutch academic history. First there was a German translation, it was very soon published after the original Dutch, then also quite soon the first English one, and so on and on and on. And even in this century, so after 2000, we have seen translations of Herfstijder Middeleeuwen appear in Chinese, in Norwegian, in Hebrew, so all over the world in fact. And I think, as I said, it's an unparalleled case, I suppose. And in all this great reception, the United States have played a very, very prominent role. As was also, again, very obvious when I got the invitation to speak here, you said very graciously, of course, you can address any subject, but it would be interesting if you said a little bit about Huizinga. So that explains a lot of his status. And I think in retrospect, like we can say of quite a few great works of art, we can also say of this work of scholarship that it was in many respects ahead of its time, and it, indeed, at least, is still very much a relevant book for our age, for its wide-ranging methodology, its interdisciplinary wide scope, art history, literary history, religious history, psychohistory, anthropology, history of rituals. They're all present in this great book. For the incredible wealth of material in the book, and especially many observations on quite interesting subjects in their own right. Let's say, for instance, costume or colors or heraldry, cursing and boasting, manners and etiquette, representation of nature, people in word and image, rituals of greeting and grief, symbolism and realism in art. It's incredibly rich. And for instance, also this moving passage, almost moving passage, on the sounds of bells in the Middle Ages and what they meant to people, great sensitivity to incredible wealth of medieval material. And then there is, of course, Huizinga's splendid eye for telling anecdotes, for quotations, and his gifts for maxims, aphorisms, and value judgments, which we may not necessarily see as ours, but that make you think and keep the reader very much awake with the book and stay with you. And then, in general, of course, his great writing style. Enchanting is the word, I suppose. The original edition appeared without any illustrations, as was Huizinga's wish at the time. They could have done a little bit not as beautiful as we can do now, of course, but he didn't want any illustrations in the book. But his whole writing style made up and more for it, because it's so vivid and visual. He has really the gift of drawing and pictures in words. But, as Proust said, of course, style is vision. And this certainly holds for Herstijk with its engaging presentation, which is in fact held together by one major leading idea. And this central idea seems to have occurred, to his own testimony at least, to Huizinga as an epiphany, almost during a walk along a canal in Groningen in 1907. He must have had this epiphany to consider, as he said, late medieval art and culture not as a prelude to the Renaissance, but indeed as the waning of the Middle Ages, as a culture still vibrant and very expressive, but in its end phase all the same. And this central idea, this leading idea to see the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, in that perspective, was of course very aptly expressed in the unforgettable metaphor of the title, Herfststijl. Of course, I came from a country where they have 4 seasons. We have 4 seasons, so we have spring, like today, and we have a certain autumn, but you have it here as well, I understood. So you are familiar with this idea of autumn being so grand, rich and colorful and beautiful and impressive and a joy to experience, but of course make no mistake, soon enough it will be winter and frost and snow will reign and covering everything with stillness, not to say death. That's the idea. And that bold thesis has not gone undisputed, of course, you know it. But I think it still has quite a lot going for it, at least as far as the Burgundian culture is concerned. That was Huizinga's primary focus. The Burgundian territories, which were at the center of his attention, he was talking about this realm, ever expanding in the late Middle Ages, as you know, and it has expanded from its homeland in Burgundy, in the northeast of France, deep into the Low Countries. There, and indeed especially at the Burgundian court, we see a climate that unmistakably has a dimension of, let's say, decadence, and that cultivated forms, which Huizinga was very sensitive about, forms that seem to distract the people from the imminent decay that they must have been aware of or afraid of, maybe even, let's say in a way of medieval swan's song, I suppose. But having said that, it is highly doubtful that this applies to the Burgundian era as a whole. That's quite a different story. And it seems as if Huizinga himself was at first perfectly aware of this, since in his preface to the book, he mentions himself the unevenness of his sources. He talks about it, he mentions it in passing, and acknowledges personally that a less gloomy picture might have emerged had he taken into account more from outside the French-oriented court culture of the time. He shows himself aware how his vision, as he says, once it was, quote, trained downward, because that was the leading idea, that this vision, again I quote, has allowed too much of the shadow of death to fall upon this work. So he was quite sensitive that this might be not fully representative for the era as a whole. And I am indeed convinced that had Huizinga looked more intensely, in fact, to sources that were in many respects closer to him, he might well have observed a different climate, and maybe never would have opted for herfstij, autumn, as his title metaphor painted quite a different picture. And it is especially what we are addressing here, the difference between late medieval courts and cities, that we have to take into account, I think. The difference that late medieval aristocrats must have been quite aware of themselves, by the way. In fact, it is reported that already in 1301, as early as that, the French queen, Joan of Navarre, on the occasion of her joyeuse entrée in Bruges, is reported to have been astonished by the luxury of the dresses of the Bruges burgeresses that came to see her along the royal route. And she is supposed to have exclaimed, "I thought I was a queen, but I see hundreds of queens here." So they must have been aware of it themselves, I think. And indeed, if we turn the camera away for some time, away from the French courts to contemporary Flemish cities, we would get quite another and less gloomy picture, I think. There is no comprehensive autumn to be seen, let alone winter at hand. In fact, there is rather the blooming of the Middle Ages that we are looking at. And to do that culture justice, I think it's appropriate now to look at it in its own right for a moment and to portray its character in its own terms. And also to do so from a slightly earlier perspective, because this region, of course, had very much a life and character of its own before it became a Burgundian crown jewel. These were the Low Countries at the beginning of the 14th century. And the first thing that you notice right away will be that they were highly fragmented. It's of course a relatively small space, but still highly fragmented as territories. They lacked any central authority. There was no kingdom whatsoever. Rather, it was a patchwork of territories. It was Flanders, Brabant, Hainaut, Holland, Zeeland, Gelre, all separately reigned by counts or dukes who would be paying homage to either the French crown or the German emperor. So there were not at all any overpowering monarchs present, but all the more many well-developed cities. And as a whole, the region was highly urbanized. In fact, it was the most densely urbanized medieval region north of the Alps. This is a slide that illustrates this. Obviously, the most colorful parts are the most densely urbanized ones. And highly characteristic for the Low Countries at the time was the existence of many cities on relatively short distances, in close proximity. So, cities that tourists still, of course, like to visit very much for their medieval atmosphere. I couldn't resist the temptation. Maybe you've been there. If not, it would be certainly something to consider. This is Bruges. Well, I wouldn't have recommended to go in Bruges at night in medieval times. So a lot of it has changed, but it's very useful. But as it has a unique atmosphere still, of course. These are still beautiful cities. And like this, the medieval Low Countries had to offer many cities, quite a few of them, in size ranging from about, which is quite small, of course, 2,000 people, up till 40,000 at the time for Bruges, then the major port of Northern Europe, and even close to 60,000 in the case of nearby Ghent. this being the second city on the European continent, second only to Paris, so quite large. All these cities, they belonged, of course, to territories governed by counts or dukes, whom they had to obey in principle, but in the meantime, they strove to maximize their autonomy, politically, judicially, financially, and even military. And in all this, the atmosphere in these cities was, of course, obviously much more mercantile than courtly, and the culture was much more bourgeois one than an aristocratic one. And as an emblem for this, I present you this. This is the ledger of a Bruges private banker and money changer from 1369, so it's quite old. And this symbolized, for the time being at least, that it was trade that counted there, and money made the world go round in Bruges far more than birth or land. And parallel to this runs one other major difference, namely the use of Dutch rather than French. Like in every multilingual situation which we have here, of course, the picture is, of course, a fluid one, so we shouldn't simplify this, but, and there were Dutch-speaking nobles, and there were French-speaking merchants, but basically, the dominant language within the cities was Dutch, as can be judged, for instance, from their founding charters, which is very, very significant. It can be judged from their administration, which is in Dutch, and the documents addressed to them. Quite telling is, for instance, how the Count of Flanders, when he writes to his peers, the major nobles, the leading Flemish nobility, he will write in French, and when he addresses his cities, he will write in Dutch. And also the rise of Dutch as an administrative and official language, as from, let's say, about 1200, next to Latin, of course, and French, and gradually taking the lead over those two, that derived its strongest impulses from urban writing culture. And parallel to that again, there is this extensive literature in Dutch, so not administration of literature, which is my actual field of expertise. And it is, of course, like every medieval literature in the vernacular, a truly European literature, in many respects mirroring the international tradition of, for instance, stories about King Arthur and Charlemagne, or love poetry, hagiography, and writings also of a more pragmatic nature, for instance, on medicine or chronicles, as you will have in German, in French, in English. But within the European framework, medieval literature in Dutch also shows distinctive features of its own. And in line with what has been said thus far, here again, an urban outlook often becomes quite apparent. And this even goes for chivalric literature in Dutch. So you have to be prepared for urban chivalric literature, which may seem a paradox, and in a way it is, but we can observe it in a very interesting way. I think there are many translations that have been preserved in Dutch from original French chivalric romances. And this gives us, of course, a splendid philological opportunity to compare the French original and the Dutch translation, which will very often be an adaptation rather. And that will give us insight, of course, in what obviously the Dutch poets wanted to highlight and eventually or possibly didn't want to focus upon in their stories. And there, the main trend in these Dutch adaptations of chivalric, French chivalric romances, the main trend is that they show definitely less interest in the feudal and the heroic dimensions of the old French originals, and often tend to take a quite playful view on chivalry. And such tendencies, they are even more visible in the new romances originally written in Dutch, which we also have. So it's not only translations, adaptations, but also new ones. without any direct French originals. For instance, this is in our country quite a famous one. It's an Arthurian romance of Waning, Gauvin in French, Waning. In this story, the great knight Gawain pursues at the king's command, King Arthur's command of course, a magic chessboard. And while doing so, because the king wants to have this magic chessboard, but on the road, Gawain does many noble things along the way. And this romance, naturally, of course, will portray the great Gawain in many situations of armed combat, but carries these into absurdity and into burlesque in quite a few instances. For instance, in the sheer quantities of opponents that Gauvin conquers. In the beginning of the romance, it's just a stereotypical dragon, the dwarf, the giant, the black knight, well, you have it. But then, gradually, it will mount to 200 knights, which he fights successfully all on his own, which even for a member of the Round Table and for an audience that was quite knowledgeable in what was possible in combat must have seemed quite unbelievable. 200, and later on even 1,800 opponents, plus the whole population of a castle, where he single-handedly takes out all the inhabitants. Some of you may have associations with Monty Python. He takes them out all single-handedly, as a result of which 20 wheel carts are loaded with corpses. And also many of the descriptions of violence and combat are soaked in irony. One knight receives a blow from Gauvin that, quote, his brains almost sunk in his throat. Another one becomes, quote, bereft of his head, above his ears, the rest remained upon his chest. And the third one is decapitated so that his head flew 2 meters away. And on a mountain road, somebody's, quote, arm is chopped off and fell into the valley, still warm. Also in Dutch, arm and warm, they rhyme. So all these kinds of irony, sometimes you think that medieval Dutch chivalric romances seem to address an audience that valued the genre as a kind of comedy capers. That was an association. Well, whether this is in fact the reverse side of the same coin, the coin that I'm presenting now, that will be hard to establish, but it is a fact that Middle Dutch non-fiction from the same period expresses a preference for pacification, or at least a judicial way of settling conflict rather than a violent one. And one of the strongest advocates of this view is Jan van Hoendalen. One of his works is here on the slide, who was around 1340 the highest ranking civil servant in the then rising city of Antwerp. In his many writings, Hoendalen's outlook is fully in line with this position, and Hoendalen stresses the primate of the economy for society's well-being. He highly sympathizes with labor and commerce, and in an almost modern way underscores individual fulfillment and responsibility for the good and benefit of all. In fact, the bourgeois virtues so eminently outlined by Professor Deirdre McCloskey, they come already quite alive in this 14th century work. The highest goal for Hoendalen is that everybody should sustain himself financially and should earn his own living. Authorities are only there to facilitate this and should by no means act or feel superior. Quote, the country doesn't exist by the grace of its Lord, but by its people. And also the pretensions of the church and the clergy are moderated by Jan van Hoendalen, while on the other hand he stresses that the layman should by no means minimize himself. For a moment, look at this quote. Maybe I can read it in Dutch, in Middle Dutch to you, and at the right you will see my homemade English translation. I hope I didn't make too many mistakes, but I read it in Dutch. Here he addresses his audience. Du leekman en ontzie die niet. Dat paapschap, so the clergy, en is zeker niet hemelieks dan du best. By no means more sure of the kingdom of heaven than you are. And then his motto, I put it in the italics, die best leeft, best is. He who lives best is the best. Al predikt het paapschap Gods woord en haar theologie brengt voort en de du zit daar voor haar voeten. Du best lichte, alzo zoete en de alzo weert voor de aanschien ons heren, als zie zien die leren. So, very confident, and such must have been apparently the climate in the leading circles within the city. Self-confident, dynamic, optimistic, and with a great faith in individual human accomplishment. Die best leeft, best is. And according to Jan van Boendalen, this man, even the son of a weaver or a blacksmith can become pope. And the simple workman who lifts and drags bags of corn all day long, is when he lives decently more noble, he says, than a king's son who is dishonest. And also the history of Rome, he says, it shows that it were often the newcomers who advanced the city and not the establishment. Of quite a few of Boendale's sayings, when presented as isolated quotes, one would never suspect them to go as far back as 1340. And indeed, these bourgeois virtues that you see so much, Professor McCloskey, exemplified in Dutch 17th century, that they may have much deeper roots even in the Low Countries. And within these dynamic cities of the Low Countries, there must also have flourished quite independent attitudes towards religion. And maybe even more significant, the urge and the courage and the freedom to express such attitudes in writing, even where they challenged orthodoxy. And two shining Middle Dutch examples of this are splendidly portrayed in Professor McGinn's great work on the history of mysticism. Well, I hope you don't mind if I express especially that how honored I feel by your presence here. Your work is so impressive. It's an unparalleled example, I think, of breadth of scope and depth of scholarship. It's magnificent. And also what you wrote about the authors in my field. Nobody in the Low Countries could do anything like that. It was really, really impressive. And the way you outline or highlight two major examples of Dutch religious authors, it's a great pleasure to refer to that here. Of course, there's the great figure of the mystic Hablich. This is one of her the manuscripts of her poems. 13th century guy, probably guy, mystic, possibly also from Antwerp, whose mysticism was characterized by Professor McGinn as ranking among the most daring of the whole medieval period. And then next to her, a little later, is in the 14th century, the great master Jan van John Roesbroek, who was, to quote again Professor McGinn, highly original in his mystical teaching, and whose chef d'oeuvre, The Spiritual Espousals, was recently called by Daniel Hobbins one of the most original and daring works of late medieval theology. Next to these two great, major, and highly original authors, I'd like to introduce today a third religious writer in Middle Dutch, who as such is quite new on the international platform, I suppose, and quite understandably so, since it has only been recently that his profile, the profile of this anonymous author, has been convincingly identified as the one man, indeed, the one man behind a vast collection of 14th century Dutch translations of a whole library of Latin texts, all stemming from the canon of the medieval church. All these translations, as could be established from sound philological argument, came from the quill of one and the same translator, who thus produced an oeuvre that's absolutely impressive, I think. I invite you to take a look at it. He translated all on his own, and subsequently, the Legenda Aurea, the Bible, Regula Benedicti, Gregory the Great Homilia, Gregory the Great Liber Dialogorum, Cassian, Collationis Patrum, Bonaventura again, Vitas Patrum, Grunge Text, Apophthegmata Patrum. All these translations by this one man were produced between 1357 and 1388, so in about 30 years. I've done a little bit of arithmetic. It's almost 2 million words, which means roughly 1,000 words weekly for 30 years. That's something that even some academics will not deliver, I suppose. Really impressive. It has also been established that this translator must have been a Carthusian monk from the Charterhouse of Herne, nearby Brussels. And him being a monk, of course, is fully in line, if you just look at the titles, with the distinctive monastic character of most of his works, obviously. And also, I suppose, fully in line with the absolute seclusion and the book-centered character of Carthusian lifestyle. That surely must have fostered a massive production during 30 years, and as he says himself, eenpaarlijk, he puts it, which means constantly, unlagging, never relaxing, day by day. And just imagine somebody over a period of 30 years in his Carthusian cell must have been translating and working on this momentous task that he must have set himself. Of particular interest in all this, of course, is his translation of the Bible, which eventually would become his most widely disseminated work, translated very faithfully from the Vulgate, with the addition of some interspersed prologues of his own hand, which must have served as introductions, as accessus, more or less in a medieval sense, to his translation. And for us, of course, these prologues are highly enlightening, since they give insight in the circumstances surrounding this project. And it is from these prologues that we learn, for instance, that the work was delivered in installments, so to say, in what seems to be a logical order. And in a separate slide, I've illustrated this. Installment is with one L, isn't it? Yeah, okay. I wasn't sure. Okay. In installments. First, the history books and the New Testament done as a harmony. Then, 2 years later, the poetic wisdom books, and then, 20 years later, the prophetic books. Even if this were the translator's only work, it would already entitle him, I suppose, to a place of honor among medieval religious authors. For as far as I know, he was the first in any vernacular to produce an almost complete Bible translation single-handedly. Only the Apocalypse and the letters of St. Paul are left out, and the rest is there. And this all speaks, of course, for an incredible stamina and dedication, which must surely have been fully his own. But as an individual, as this undertaking must have been, he must have felt by no means alone in it, for he undertook the project with a very definite readership in mind. As his prime reader, he addresses a certain Jan Taaie, who was around, we know him from archival sources, around 1360, a member of one of Brussels' most prominent families, and himself an alderman of the city. This Jan Taaie seems not to have been just a supporter of the project, a benefactor in the traditional way, but must have been personally highly interested in the work. In fact, he may well have been the major driving force behind the project in the first place, even up to overcoming certain misgivings and hesitations that the translator himself seems to have had. For in quite a few prologues there appear phrases that in all their diplomatic understatement seem quite telling. I invite you to look at some quotations, and there are more like this, taken from subsequent phases of the project. And again, I've tried to translate them in English, and I will read them to you in Dutch. And here you see something I think quite interesting happening. Here is he addressing his first reader, so to say. Lieve en de geminde Jan Taaien, ik mag spreken tot uw eenradige begeerte en tot uw goede willen, die mij gedwongen hebben en de verwongen, which have forced and conquered me. And then in phase 2 he says, want miens willen was niet meer van het Bibelen te dietsen te trekken uit de Latine, dan dat ter lopende historie toe behoorde. What belonged to the historical narration of the Bible, the historical books. Nochtans dukt me, als ik verstaan heb in uw brieven dikwijlen, as I've understood from your frequent letters, dat gij daarmede niet tevreden en ziet. You are not satisfied with this. And later on, nochtans dunkt me, alzo ik verstaan heb in uw brieven dikwijlen, dat gij daarmede niet gepaaid en ziet. Gij had daartoe ook Salomons boeken. You would also want to receive the books of Solomon. And then, onze vriend, Taaien again, die ons die Bijbel deed beginnen, en laat ons niet gerusten. He will not let us rest. En zie dat wie ze hem leveren in gelieke talen al uit. We have to do everything. So, there seems to have been quite some frictions as this project went along between the translator and his almost too eager reader, first reader, but even more so between the translator and some of his fellow clerics. From the outset, the translator seems to have been aware of the suspicion that his work would surely arouse. And again, increasingly so as he progressed through the Bible from the relative straightforward narrative books to the more spiritual and demanding ones. The frowning of skeptics then turned into scandalizing by outright adversaries. Let's look at some quotations again, all again lifted from his prologues. Dit werk dat ik meen te onderstaan, I'm about to undertake, en is geen klein ding, maar het is een werk van grote pienen en de arbeiden, dat nu menige asten en de nachtslaap benemen zal eer volbrengen. Nochtans weet ik wel dat het zal zien zeer benieuwd onder die clergie. I'm fully aware that it will be very much frowned upon by the clergy, for it annoys some clerics that one should communicate the secrets of Scripture to ordinary people. En willen niet weten dat Christus apostelen, they refuse to accept that Christ's apostles spoke in all languages, in alle tongen spraken, en de haar leerlingen beschreven en de predikten den volken. So they will not accept that. And then there's a similar passage. For I know very well that this work will be vilified out of hatred by malicious men who will reject. It goes on and on and on. And more like this. Surely I know and expect that our work will be very much envied and vilified by fierce dogs. Beknaagd van verwoede honden. But my good intentions are known to God, and therefore I can say with David, prophet of course, ik hoop in God, I rest my faith in God, and will not fear what men might do to me. And then again, so all in all he comes back to this issue. It has become apparent by now to us that there are many who will slander this work out of hatred rather than praise its virtues, and who will scandalize our translation towards uneducated people. And I do not doubt for a moment that my work and labor will be severely scandalized out of hatred. Of course, these quotes are taken from long text, so it's not right after each other, of course. But when you see them together, they're quite telling, I think. And again, in his translation later on in his life, when he translated the dialogues of Gregory, vele geleerde lieden die lachteren en they condemn dat men de lekenmensen de schrifturen in dietsen maakt. There's a lot of opposition. So, worthy and dedicated as it was, this enterprise of Bible translation seems not to have gone without a lot of strife and unrest. And we can safely presume, I think, that these prologues offer only a very subdued impression of the complex, the delicate, and sometimes even contested context into which this translation apparently originated. It seems to have developed against the grain, and I think we can safely suppose that it would never have been finished if not for this highly eager, this determined and persuasive urban readership who put, so to say, the translator over the edge, while many of his fellow clerics seem to have considered that precisely the no-go area. While, since, as you know, there was a lot of opposition against the whole idea of making the Bible translation, there was a preferred expression that said that the feet and hands of the church, the lay people, the feet and hands of the church should not attend the work of the army. But still, this translation came to be. So, all in all, we have Hadewig in 13th century Antwerp, Rusbroek in 14th century Brussels, and this anonymous translator with connections in that city, who, however different they may have been as individuals, all seem to have been testing the limits of permissiveness. Authors in Middle Dutch that were at least at odds with authority. Now, Hadewig, of course, refrains from outright criticism of the church, while Rusbroek is next to daringly speculative, also remarkably balanced. And this Bible translator doesn't become wary of stressing his good intentions. So they probably didn't want to, or at least took care not to overstep red lines. They were very effective in negotiating the new, but I realize this might be overstretching the mercantile metaphors with this negotiating a little bit too much, but still. But I wonder also, and this brings me to the conclusion, one other serious possibility that I would like to offer for discussion here, that the sheer fact of these texts being in Dutch might have given them some extra protection. It's only a hypothesis in this stage of my research, but if I may sketch it for a moment in some broad strokes, to become object of inquisition, I think, or just examination on the grounds of doubtful orthodoxy by church authority, there had to be suspicions, of course. But then, to actually establish what was going on, and whether that might contradict orthodoxy, this required, of course, familiarity and even fluency, I suppose, in the language involved, since it could be very small words that counted here. And so to pursue suspicion, that implied in-depth analysis of texts, discussion, and maybe even interrogation of writers and readers involved, and this again implied almost complete proficiency in the Dutch language. Now, the Low Countries didn't have a university at the time yet, although Paris was fairly nearby, of course, where, as we know, the Sorbonne was a major force behind the Inquisition, working together as an arbiter of orthodoxy with the royal court, it seems, crown and gown. But doesn't it seem quite plausible that the Parisian masters, on the lookout for erroneous ideas expressed in the vernacular, must have been much better equipped and effective to investigate French texts than Dutch ones? And next to that, in the Low Countries, Also, the majority of bishops were fairly at a distance, as my next slide may show. If you look at this, all the bishops' residences, in fact, were all below the language border, the red line I've drawn, the actual residences of bishops, all below the language border, except, of course, for the Diocese of Utrecht. So all these bishops held their courts in French-speaking towns. Of course, their formal jurisdiction stretched much further and absolutely covered the whole diocese, including the Dutch-speaking cities, of course. But I think their acute surveillance and span of control might well have been a little smaller and best established in the French-speaking areas directly surrounding them. And as a further check for this hypothesis, I turned, of course, to the great work of Paul Frederick, who in a lifetime of scholarly devotion has collected all testimonies of Inquisition in the medieval Low Countries, the Corpus Inquisitionis Neerlandicae, by great scholar Frederick. His corpus lists for the period between the 1025 and 1400, so quite a few centuries, he lists around 250 cases of condemnation, many of them, of course, including multiple individuals and even sometimes whole groups as suspects. Now, I'm not an expert on this, not at all even, but to begin with, it strikes me as a fairly low total maybe, but I find this difficult to judge. Maybe some of you have a more clear idea about that, but anyway, Frederick's corpus arranges the cases in chronological order. But in preparing this talk, I have redistributed them according to diocese, so regionally instead of chronologically. And out of this, a quite interesting pattern emerged, I suppose. I can show you on the map again, now with the amount of cases put next to the dioceses. And I wonder, isn't it significant that the Bishop of Utrecht seems to have been more effective in condemning heresies than his colleagues? By the way, I would not know of any more or less dissident religious text in medieval Dutch originating from Utrecht or its immediate surroundings. And now I'm inclined to relate this to the overpowering presence of the bishop in this region. While on the other hand, in Flemish cities, the creation of challenging religious literature in Dutch seems to have been a more or less regular affair. For other instances, other examples could be added to the ones that I've discussed today. Well, all this is of course in a strictly preliminary phase, but for the time being it seems to support the idea that in the southern Low Countries it might well have been the French-speaking parts that were under control of authority, much less so than the regions where Dutch was the primary language. And so maybe indeed Dutch offered some sort of cordon sanitaire. And to pursue it just a little further, it is of course to be remembered that when Jan van Rysselhoek aroused the suspicion of Chancellor Jean Gerson, because monks from neighboring institutions drew the Chancellor's attention to the work of Rysselhoek, which was probably not a very nice gesture of these colleagues, but they drew his attention that something fishy might be in these works. Well, anyway, to make it possible in the first place for Gerson to examine Rysselhoek's views, his major work first had to be translated into Latin. The original Dutch simply wouldn't serve for this purpose. And as another case in point, it is maybe not meaningful that Heinrich seems to have lived a life full of struggle and friction with outsiders, whom she calls the vreemden, people, the strangers who don't understand, who don't accept her lifestyle, her ideas, can't understand them. So she seems to have had her fair share of conflict as well. but as far as we know at least, without being prosecuted or condemned, and was able to go on writing, while her contemporary counterpart in French-speaking Hainaut, the beguine Marguerite Bourret, who wrote and spoke in French, saw her writings publicly burned in Valenciennes before she herself was condemned at the stake. In comparison to French, medieval Dutch may well have provided some extra space and latitude for deviant religious expression. And I know some of the students are interested in this. I would be inclined to think that this even went on a little bit in the times of the Devotio Moderne. There again, we have something like that. And not in Utrecht, but across the IJssel, on a more or less safe distance. So this seems to be somewhat of a tradition of religious expression in Dutch. And as I said, there may well have been some extra space and latitude for that, for to vary on a saying, to paraphrase it, that is very well known to medievalists, and then about the Greek language, we often say, Cradle est non legitur. Well, for today I would say, Theodiscum est non legitur. It's Dutch, it's unread. And this saying applies until today, I guess. But nowadays, of course, there's no excuse for hiding in the Dutch language, and I guess I'm more or less the first to blame for this, having written these books in this language. I made that choice out of conviction that the humanities, you mentioned it, should indeed function as a double-edged sword. I'd like to see them that way, and that they have a serious obligation to address a larger audience as well. And to do so, you have to make an extra effort, I suppose, to write engagingly, which I can only do in my native language. Well, it has worked for the Low Countries, I suppose, but it came, of course, with a serious price, since on the professional side, it kept me sitting behind a one-way screen. I've often felt myself like that, on a one-way screen, reading and admiring your work without contributing myself enough to these international academic discussions. But anyway, now it's high time to make up for that seclusion, I suppose, and to present my views and my field and its object to the international forum, and to devote, I hope to do this by devoting myself in the next years to write at least one suitable book in English, or a major book if possible, in English, which has become indeed the Latin of our day, I suppose. And in that book, I hope to give Middle Dutch literature its place on the medieval European map, and I hope to have shown you today that this could be, well, not necessarily noble, but at least a worthwhile enterprise in its own right, and maybe even as a very modest supplement to the great Johan Huizinga. Thank you very much.
So just to take a comparison a little bit further, the last section of this Bible translation was roughly contemporary with the Wycliffe Bible translation.
Yeah. Exactly.
So what's the audience difference there? Because part of the problem with the Wycliffe Bible was that it was a wider intended audience.
Yeah.
I mean, do you know much about it?
I suppose in this case as well. There is obviously one personal, and this is different with the Wycliffe Bible, for as much as I know of it, of course, but there's one major person, Jan Tye, involved in it. But, I should say, during the 14th century, this Bible translation spread only very, as far as our documents go, very meagerly. And in small manuscripts. We see that more often. That, well, these are difficult associations, I suppose, but you get the feeling that these books aren't yet ready to be shown and to be exposed. It's more a little bit shadowy, let's say, to keep them in the shadow. But then in the 15th century, many copies were made, and even very beautiful ones. So, and well, I can't imagine that the translator was satisfied with the simple idea that one man would appreciate his writings and that nothing more were to come on. But the parallels with the Wycliffe Bible are, of course, very, very interesting. Yes. Because there we had, of course, an outright case of heresy, or at least debate about it. Let's be careful.
In the 14th century, less outright heresy than by the early 15th century.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe at first also.
Yeah.
And then to Bohemia. Yeah. It's a fascinating case. And there in Bohemia again, you see the modern devotio moderne. I think there's a lot to explore there.
Yeah.
And that in earlier generations, people of my age and the generation earlier, these wider perspectives on these parallels and maybe even direct influences on individual levels between England, the Low Countries, Bohemia, that Goethe may have studied in Prague. It's not sure, but it's one of his biographers says so at least, that we are only at the beginning of exploring these large, wide connections, having been narrowed down too much in a nationalist perspective, I suppose.
First of all, I would love a book on Dutch literature to assign to students someday in English. That would be wonderful. A few of them are coming out from Deutsch now, and it would be a great balance for Northern European medieval studies. Would really look forward to that. But my question is that, and I'm sorry to go to an edge for illustration, but this happens to be my field, is that do you think that there's considerable freedom as well in illustrations for Dutch vernacular books, particularly from violence discussed in your work, as opposed to, say, in contemporary French within Modern Day or later texts?
That's very interesting idea. I wouldn't know of any research having been done or actually being done at the moment on that subject. The freedom in illustrations. And are you thinking about specific themes or motives or?
Well, I think that biblical illustrations, the Biblia Historial, or maybe even Wunderbook in Germany versus the Netherlands. You could talk about that. I mean, there's just so much, and so many Dutch manuscripts are digitized too.
Sure. So now there's the opportunity. You're quite right to say so. You know probably that neither the work of Hadwig nor Roosboek has any illustrations. But Marot, glad you mentioned him. That's again, that's a case of relatively early taking the liberty of bringing the Bible there to lay folks. Of course, in this case, not the full translation from Vulgate, but from the Historia Scholastica. So it's a little different, but still, and there are some definite testimonies that say that Marot got into conflict with church authority on this again. And so that's 1260. Again, we see this liberty in the Dutch language, but well, I should cultivate a tunnel vision, I suppose, but it's tempting. It's tempting. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a charming argument, and I want to know more about it. That this feudally, this not very feudalized area with a rather light aristocracy, with its towns, was making fun of aristocratic conventions. And I think, of course, of Don Quixote.
Yeah.
Much later.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting, your argument sheds light on Cervantes, because you think, oh well, he's making fun of the hierarchy, perhaps in as cautious a way as a Spanish could. But let's see, the point I wanted to make more to the point. Oh yes. Do you think that English-based medieval discussions of markets, merchants, are more hostile to bourgeois values than these people? It's my impression that they are.
Oh, well, you're much more knowledgeable on this than I am. No, really, it's a fact. I know the Dutch text quite well. That's my contribution probably. But so yeah, this hostility. I think you're quite right in suggesting this possibility. Yes, and the association with Cervantes hasn't come up to me yet, but that must be also because coming from the Netherlands, I'm rather safe than sorry, I suppose myself. It's a bold association, but very very tempting one. So might well be. And there's a lot of tongue in cheek in these Dutch romances, and at first I didn't notice that myself. My earlier work introduced me as an eminence grise, so okay, I have to accept that, I suppose. So my earlier work wasn't very sensitive to this humor and this irony in these romances, but once you look more closely, you see that this must have made fun also about these conventions. This really seems to be a bourgeois attitude.
It's just more of an observation than a question, but the defense that the anonymous translator makes for translating very, very close to what Meister Eckhart does at the end of the Book of Consolation, where he says, many people are saying to me, we should make these things available to the common people and the laity, but if we don't do it, who will? And also the scriptures are written for everybody, and they are so profound references at the beginning of John's prologue. So I doubt that the author would have known the Book of Consolation, but I don't know whether it's available in Dutch.
Well, you know, if I remember correctly, you've written about it yourself, that there might have been connection between Eckhart and Loose books.
Oh, I think so.
Well, these are contemporaries, and it's a region of Brussels.
Certainly some of Eckhart's sermons are translated.
Yeah, sure. So that, yeah, that's really
and the
great.
difference in time is not that great. Like 20 when he's writing that. And shortly before he's under investigation for
Sure. Yeah. So thank you for that.
So time for Cells. Mr. Cells, I don't know.
Yes, thank you. I have one question with a tiny addendum comment. The question would be, in thinking about daring and freedom, I was wondering if you might address Hadovich or Hadovich to whoever wrote the Waning edition, which seemed to be, from a lyrical point of view, quite extraordinary for their time and place. I don't know many parallels.
No.
And that's my question about the way that this extraordinary lyricism is happening in Dutch in this very early period. And my appended notation to that is Professor Oostrom read it in Dutch for my class, and it's so extraordinary. And then she showed me your ad. And so my suggestion would be, if only your ad addressed those of us in the early generation who don't do iPhone, but do internet. Like internet is now passe. So is there a way we can get it on our computers instead of true that
In fact, this way is already available. It is already available on the internet. After the success, we first brought it out as an app for iPad, indeed. Then I got a lot of mails about people, from people I didn't know that there was a real war going on, that I shouldn't confess only to the Apple community, but I should also be, well, okay, I made that as well. But it's now also available on the internet, www.vogela.org, I think, or .com. You'll find it readily available for it's just a tool for education and for pleasure. It has no scientific scholarly pretensions. It's a lovely thing.
I think it brings the Dutch language alive, and it allows those of us with hopes of sometimes learning it, to learn it from these great authors. So I just want to thank you for that contribution.
It could be done for Middle English as well. For Old French and Latin. So maybe we should make a big project out. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, a question for complete ignorance, as the typical for Dutch citizens who know Dutch history. But with that, for example, could you say something more about literacy in the 14th century in the Netherlands? And what practical difference it would have made to have these translations? Was there such a large group that would have been literate with Dutch, but not literate in other languages? What percentage are we talking about?
We don't have a clue. But that there must have been such an audience. It seems quite obvious from the fact that these translations came to be, and many of them. And even sometimes multiple translations. For instance, from the Romance of the Rose, not chivalric Romance, but the courtly one, we have 2, maybe even 3 Middle Dutch translations. From the Lancelot en Prose, huge French prose cycle, 3 independent Dutch translations. So there must have been quite a sizable, or at least a very eager audience that wanted to hear them in Dutch, I suppose. And then I suppose it implied is that couldn't understand them in French.
And so, when you're thinking about translations for performance, or also for leadership?
Both. It's certainly also for performance. Most of these translations were done in rhyme. Well, that doesn't say everything, but general ideas that these are particularly suitable for performance. So that must have been the case, yes. And as early as, let's say, medium 13th century. So from between 1250 to 1350, in that century, many translations saw the light. Ingeborg Clear even spoke about the Übersetzungsfreudigkeit of the Dutch literary world. Übersetzungsfreudigkeit. Lovely word.
Yes, Mr. J.
Can I come back to Waning to the Middle Ages for a moment? How present in Huizinga's mind do you think the parallel between what he saw as the decadence of the late Middle Ages and the decadence of his own time was? Did that play a role in this big conception that came to him?
He never said anything, as far as I know, explicitly about that. But it's still quite feasible, because you may know that from his other work, his later work, of course, Huizinga was very much worried about decadence of European culture, and patriarchy, so there may have been some connection. There's one other connection that I didn't mention because it made it so personal then, but it must have played a role. Huizinga was struck a few years before Herfsta appeared by the very early death of his wife, whom he loved very much, and they had 4 children. It left him as a widower This was also one of the reasons that he didn't want any illustrations in the book. There's just one, what do you call this, vignette, in memory, in memory of her death. So he was, disagreeing between the lines, of course, but I'm not the first to suggest that this whole idea of civilization going down was also influenced by very tragic experiences in his personal life. But at the center, I think, is still this scholarly idea. After having visited the major exhibition of Flemish primitive pictures in Bruges already in 1904, if I'm correct, and later he said that has been one of the major experiences of his life. There he saw Jan van Eyck and great Flemish primitive painters, and in the Bruges context, there he must have realized already, or let's say there was some germ, some first idea that these pictures, these paintings should be presented in their medieval context rather than as a starting of the Renaissance. So it's a complex situation, I think, but very fascinating. By the way, I'll tell you one more project that I'm dreaming about. In 2019, it will be 100 years that Herfstijk appeared. Now, an idea what I would like to pursue is to bring out a centenary edition of the work, with in the center, of course, the text of Herfstijk Middeleeuwen, and then, like a medieval manuscript with its glosses around it, to give the audience and the public an idea of the huge scholarly impact it has had in discussions, influence on Umberto Eco, on Jacques Goff, but also on many individual publications from Japan, from wherever, that relate to Huizinga and discuss with this great book, up to even, maybe some of you have seen this, the opening scene of the film Love Story. There, when the young people meet, and of course first they quarrel, and later on, of course, it turns out to be a great romantic love, and that it's when the girl is working as a library assistant in the library of Radcliffe College, and this preppy Harvard student, Ryan O'Neill, rushes in, and this is the first line of the film, and he says, "Do you have the Waning of the Middle Ages?" That's how the film starts. In the Dutch translation, in the subtitle, it says, "Do you have to het einde van de middeleeuwen?" The end of the Middle Ages. So this was done by somebody who didn't know his classics. Well, this is a sideline, but it has been a very influential book, and I would like to present it that way and to show it, if I may say, also to a younger generation. If I may say, this is how scholarship works. There are major books, major ideas, and they work like a chorale with a lot of things around it, and well, that's inspiring. Sorry for this. This is not an answer to everything we were looking for. It just came out 2019, maybe. Well.
More questions? Can I ask a question?
Please.
Well, it's about Huizinga. In my own work, say on the 12th century, I've been quite interested in what he wrote on what he calls esprit pré-gothique. People like Abelard, John of Salisbury. How does that relate for him to, say, the waning of the Middle Ages? Where I've never been able to figure out where
if there's a connection. He didn't make it himself either. And he wrote already before the waning of the Middle Ages, before Herfstijk, he wrote on Alain's of Insulis, an article, not a book.
Yes.
But for him, it seems to be more or less separate. The Middle Ages start again, and then in their decay. That's how he seems to view it. By the way, I don't know if you realize, Huizinga was also here in 1926. he visited America after having written already a book on America, without ever having been here. And this book was favorably received in the American Historical Review, and the reviewer said, this is an amazing thing. Somebody writes about America in a very conspicuous way, very sensitive way, without ever having been here. And people said to him, this is amazing, you have never been? And then he said, well, I've never been to the Middle Ages either. So really hermeneutic talent he must have had. But he was also in Chicago. And you showed me the Cradle club where he must have had lunch. Oh, interesting. 1926, May 1926 it was.
Good. Well, I think if we have no more questions, I would like to invite you all to a reception, which is downstairs in the common room. You just go down all the stairs and then you turn left into a hallway and again to the left. So you're most welcome to join us for a reception. And please let me thank Professor van Oostrom for a wonderful trip to the Middle Ages and more engagement with Huizinga. Thank you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.